Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Rosecliff Mansion. I'm Keith Stokes, a trustee of the Preservation Society of Newport County, and this is a part of the lecture series that we have as a part of the exhibit, Gilded Age Newport in Color. The Gilded Age Newport in Color exhibit is presented by and curated by the Preservation Society and the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. I'd have to be remiss if I didn't recognize my wife, Teresa, the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. What's most exciting about this exhibit, which will run until June 30th, it provides an interpretation for the first time of the history of the Gilded Age, but from the experiences of African heritage men, women, and families. What's most exciting and most prideful for us being in Newport, many of the most dynamic men, women, and early African heritage institutions of that time are happening right here in this community. In many cases, right along Bellevue Avenue, and in neighborhoods that today are called Historic Hill, Yachting Village, and Thames Street. So this exhibit is an opportunity for us to provide a broader expression and appreciation of the Gilded Age, but also from the perspective of all the men, women, and families that represent diverse race, ethnic, and most importantly, class and cultural perspectives that were also part of the Gilded Age of America. This first lecture series will be a part of 3. I want to ensure you that if you have the opportunity to enjoy this lecture, which is going to be fantastic, we ask that you also possibly take the time to return to 2 additional lectures. The next lecture will be on May 16th. It is called Am I Not a Man and a Woman? And the Rise of African Heritage Politics. That'll be presented by the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society and myself. That particular lecture will include images from the collections of a number of historical societies across the state, predominantly the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, and specifically images where you'll get to see what black businesses, black churches, and black social and civic life was like right here in Newport at the turn of the 20th century. On June 6th, we have Dr. Meyer Armistead. Dr. Armistead is a professor at Bard. Most importantly, Meyer in 1999 developed this incredible research and book on the histories of African heritage people in Saratoga Springs and also in Newport at that time. Meyer will come and talk about what she calls the eclectic and independent experience of early African heritage communities in America and how they would take their wealth, their access to opportunity and education, and parlay that into building the future of African heritage people across America. But tonight we're here to hear from Dr. Square. I had the opportunity to meet Jonathan online, like most of us over the last 3 years, as we've all tried to work through COVID and the pandemic, and I found his work absolutely astounding. His blending of the history of black history with fashion and culture and identity is something I've never seen before or heard before. And I was most excited with the fact that his undergraduate degree was at Cornell University, my alma mater, so I had to say, that's a smart guy. But I want to take the time to introduce you to Dr. Square and really present his credentials, which I think are extraordinary, and we are certainly honored and privileged to have him lecture us today. Dr. Jonathan Michael Square is an assistant professor of black visual culture at Parsons School of Design. He earned a PhD from New York University and a master's from the University of Texas in Austin and his bachelor degree from the great Cornell University. I added great to that. Previously, he taught in the Committee on Design and degree in History and Literature at Harvard University and was a fellow in the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He has curated the exposition, Past and Present, Black Artists Respond to the Complicated Histories of Slavery at the Herron School of Art and Design, which closed in January of 2023. He is currently preparing for his upcoming show, yet to be named, at an African-American picture gallery at the Winterthur Museum, Garden and Library in 2025. Dr. Square also leads the Digital Humanities Project, Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom. It's an online forum that I urge each and everyone tonight to log on and participate. It's an incredible journey on education, history, and fashion. He is also in the process of finishing a book manuscript tentatively titled Negro Cloth, How Slavery Birthed the American Fashion Industry, which is under contract at Duke University Press and is slated to be published in the mid-2015. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Michael Square. Doctor.
Wow, thank you so much for that introduction. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I have to start off by showing gratitude to Keith Stokes and Teresa Guzman Stokes and Kate Pedersen in the back, and also Leslie Jones for having me here. And I'm just going to jump right into my presentation. So today I'm going to talk about W.E.B. Du Bois, and a very important figure from the Gilded Age. And as Keith mentioned in the introduction, I'm currently working on a book manuscript, and Du Bois figures prominently in this book. He's actually sort of the last chapter of this book. The book is on enslaved people's dress, and I sort of end with Du Bois because I end with freedom. And so it's organized roughly chronologically, so I end in the late 19th century, early 20th century with Du Bois. So I'm excited to share my research with you all. Feel free to, there's gonna be a short Q&A after talk. Feel free to give any comments, suggestions, critiques. Look forward to hearing your feedback. So jumping right into my presentation, so the title of the chapter and the title of this talk is The Measure of a Man, Double Consciousness and the Fashioning of W.E.B. Du Bois. One of the things that I talk about in the chapter is I unpack Du Bois's idea of double consciousness. And double consciousness is the idea that he coined that Black Americans have sort of two forms of consciousness, their own idiosyncratic perception of themselves, but also they have to navigate prejudice and discrimination and how the larger society viewed them. And I look at this idea of double consciousness through his own self-fashioning. So I start off the chapter with this image. This is an image that's archived in Harvard University archives. As you can see, Du Bois was photographed nude in this photograph. Sometimes when I show this photograph to students, they assumed that he was targeted because he was a man of color, but in reality, all Harvard students were subjected to this type of photography in the late 19th, well into the 20th century, actually. At a lot of universities, elite universities, undergrads were photographed. This was the era of racial science and hierarchy of races, and so there was an attempt to sort of quantify and classify the human body. So all Harvard undergrads were photographed in this way, and they're archived at Harvard University Press. And the reason that I start off with this photograph is because I'm interested in how Du Bois sort of learned this visual vocabulary from this experience. And so you'll see him repeating this sort of forward and profile sort of mugshot style photography later in this photographic curatorial work. So I start off with this with this photograph. But in the chapter, I'm more interested in Du Bois's early years, like the first few decades of his life, when he is becoming Du Bois. In his youth, he was known as Willie, and over the course of his life, he sort of transformed himself. He fashioned himself into W.E.B. Du Bois, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. So let's jump back to 1868. So this is Du Bois as an infant. Du Bois was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, which is in western Massachusetts. He grew up in a place where several generations of his family had been, well into the 18th century. It was a very different experience than growing up in the American South, dealing with sort of virulent racism and discrimination. That's not to say that there wasn't racism. There certainly was, and he certainly grew up impoverished. But he grew up in a place where many people knew his family. He also was able to be educated, and so when I look at this photo, it makes me think of other photographs of African Americans from the 19th century. Often, there's a bit of anger or confusion because the photographs were taken under duress. In this photograph, and the other photograph that I'll show you right after this, you see that Du Bois, a certain confidence. He understands the power of photography, as in this photograph. But going back to this photograph, he's photographed with this aunt. Unfortunately, haven't been able to identify the name of his aunt. Maria Silvina Burghardt Du Bois had two sisters, and I'm not sure which sister this is. But as you can see, they're all very well dressed in all photographs of Du Bois throughout his entire life. Du Bois was always well-dressed. What's interesting about Du Bois, this is the year he was born in 1868. He lived into 1963, so he lived for nearly a century, well into his 90s, and he was photographed every year of his life, from 1868 to 1963. So you're able to really track sort of his interactions with photography, how he styled himself, his self-fashioning is all documented. He was also a fastidious archiver. He kept everything, all his photographs, all his papers, and it's all been archived and available online by UMass Amherst. So all these images that I'm going to show you and much, much more are available for any researcher to consult. But back to this photograph of Du Bois when he's 4 years old. As you can see, again, he understands the power of photography. He's looking directly at the photographer. He's also very well dressed in this photograph with the stockings and the sort of velvety suit that he's wearing and the booties. When I look at this photo, to me it reads very Victorian, sort of the sumptuousness of the textiles that are in the photograph. Even the jewelry that he's wearing. Again, he's very poised and he understands the power of photography, even from the young age of 4. If anyone's seen a young child being photographed, knows that like getting this photograph, particularly in the 19th century, like this is before iPhones, but they got the photo. So this is Du Bois in his high school class photo. He graduated in 1884. Great Barrington allocated about $2,000 a few years before he was born for the building of a high school. And so public education was available to many people in Great Barrington, which is unusual in the 19th century. Public education wasn't always available. And even at this point, it wasn't segregated. So Du Bois started with another black student. That black student ended up dropping out, and he was the only black student from 1884 to graduate in 1884. But he was able to get a decent education in Great Barrington, which allowed him to later matriculate into Fisk University and so subsequently Harvard University. What was really interesting about this photo is that you see he's the only black student in high school, and also he's sort of at the margins of the group. With his leg is crossed, and he's carrying a boulder in his hand. So this is Du Bois in 1888. By this time, he is an undergrad at Fisk University. So he was an exemplary student in high school, and many of the community members raised money for him to attend Fisk University. There happened to be a professor of Fisk who lived in Great Barrington. So that's where the idea of going to Fisk came from. And the community raised money for him to get a scholarship to go to Fisk. And this is a photograph of him alongside his classmates at Fisk University in 1888. Fisk is at HBCU, it's in Nashville, Tennessee. So he went to Fisk for a few years, and then he later transferred to Harvard University. So this is him alongside his Fisk classmates. Also, what I love about this photograph is that you see sort of the height of Edwardian, sort of Victorian fashion in this photograph. Very poised, very dapper. This is another great photograph of Du Bois. I'm not quite sure about the year. I suspect that it's 1888. Around the time that he transferred from Fisk to Harvard University. But there are a number of things I want to point out in this photograph. One, just again, he understands the power of photography, even at this young age. Like, many people of color during this time period weren't able to be photographed, and he was photographed throughout his entire life. Also, the fact that he's wearing a plaid suit, to me, is notable. Your first suit is not going to be a plaid suit. Which tells me that he had a number of suits. He was a dandy, and you can see it in his photograph. I also love the center-parted hairstyle that he's doing in this photograph. That was very much in vogue amongst men in the late 19th century. But I want to return to this photograph of Du Bois from 1888. So this is a few months as an undergrad within matriculating at Harvard University. And there are a number of notable things in the photograph that I want to draw your attention to. One, if you look along, there's literally the length of his body is measured in this photograph. He's holding a ruler in the photograph, so it's meant to measure his body. Also, he's standing with his back to the camera, front facing the camera, but also to the side. That's something that you'll see again in his curatorial work. It's something that he replicated. He sort of adopted the visual language of scientific racism and sort of turned it on its head and used it against itself. So he learned from this experience. So moving ahead to 1900, this is a photograph of Du Bois. He was tasked with curating an exhibition that was in Paris at one of the world's fairs that was in 1900. And this exhibition explored the identity and experiences of African Americans. Again, as I mentioned when I showed you this photograph from the late, when he matriculated at Harvard University, this was the heyday of scientific racism. And so the point of this exhibition was to sort of disprove or counteract the ideas of scientific racism that said that African Americans were innately inferior. And so he curated this exhibition of photographs of well-educated, well-dressed African Americans. The exhibition was called the American Negro Exhibit. And this is him in Paris when he went to mount the exhibition. And so you see, he here is the embodiment of the talented 10th. Very well dressed. What's also really interesting about this photograph is the posture. Up until the turn of the century, it was unusual to see photographs like this of people sort of standing very casually, sort of candid photographs. When you look at photographs in the 19th century, people sort of very stiff, very posed. Here he's sort of standing sort of casually. And this is a moment where you're starting to see more casual photographs, and I think that's really interesting, that posture of sort of throwing your hands in your pocket and taking a photograph. I'm really struck by that pose. But also what's really interesting about this photograph, and I'm not sure if it's going to show up on the screen, but after the photograph was developed, Du Bois, or someone else, but probably Du Bois, took a ballpoint pen and sort of outlined the edges of the photograph. Look at the sort of the closure of the waistcoat. You can see that it's been sort of made darker. A crease was added to the pants. A little bit of sheen was added to the top hat. So again, he was someone who was very thoughtful and concerned about his self-presentation to the point that he doctored photographs after they were developed. You know, this is pre-Photoshop. Well, so in 1900, Du Bois wasn't quite Du Bois yet. He was still a young academic. He was a professor at Atlanta University. He had to have the lowest ticket when he took the steamer to Paris, so he was in steerage. And so what I imagine would happen is that the clothes were a little bit rumpled in the photograph. He was embarrassed, and then later on he doctored the photo to make the clothes look a little more crisp. So I think this is an interesting photo for a number of reasons. So this is one of the photographs that was included in the exhibition. As you can see, it's three generations of an African-American family. The photo dates from 1899. The photographer of this photograph was a man named George Askew. who's a prominent African-American photographer in Atlanta. There are several George Askew photos in the American Negro exhibit. What really strikes me about this photograph, one, how well-dressed the family is, that they're very much in vogue, on trend, but also like the setting. They're sitting in a field. Many photographs of African Americans freed and enslaved were often taken without their consent, and often photos of them engaged in labor, agricultural labor. And so if this photograph was taken a few decades earlier, in the 1840s or 1850s, these folks might have been working in the field, but this is actually a moment of bourgeois leisure. It's a really emblematic photo of the American Negro exhibit. It's something that you see over and over again. If you were to Google the American Negro exhibit, this would be one of the photographs that comes up. So much so that it's often used as the cover image of The Souls of Black Folks, which is Du Bois's, one of Du Bois's first books. I also used the photo. I have a project called Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom, and I like this photo so much that I've used it as the cover image for my website for Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom. So for me, it's a really sort of hero image of the American Negro exhibit. This is another image that Du Bois included in the American Negro exhibit, and it's also an image that's included in Gilded Age Newport in color, which I highly encourage you to see. I had the pleasure and honor to see it earlier today, and I would encourage you to see it as well. This is, it's several women from the Women's League of Newport, and at the top and in the center is Mary H. Dickerson, who's an important African-American figure in the Newport community. I would encourage you, there's more about her upstairs in Gilded Age Newport in color, so learn more about Mary H. Dickerson if you visit the exhibition. But I included it in this talk because Du Bois actually included the photograph in the American Negro exhibit in Paris. So there's some overlap between Newport history and Du Bois. This is one example of that. So as I mentioned earlier, the experience of being photographed nude at his first year at Harvard was really seminal. It sort of shaped the way he understood the visual language of photography, and it's something he would replicate in his own curatorial work. So if you look at some of the images from the American Negro exhibit, and all of those images actually are available online. So his papers have been digitized and made available online through UMass Amherst. But all the images from the American Negro exhibit are available by the Library of Congress online. So all of these resources that I'm sharing are available online, including this one. So there are several portraits of African Americans in the American Negro exhibit. And most of the portraits, the sitters are photographed head on and at a profile. And so again, I imagine that Du Bois learned from the experience of being photographed and sort of adopted the language of scientific racism, but to use it against itself to prove the beauty, grace, intelligence, success of African Americans. Just to go back to that image and show the relationship between this. It's a way of photographing that we associate with mugshots, but it's sort of rooted in this late 19th century moment. And Du Bois adopted it in the American Negro exhibit. So another thing that I do in the chapter, the chapter is centered on Du Bois, but I'm also interested in Harvard University and its relationship with the history of racial science in the United States. And I'm particularly interested in a set of photographs that were taken of enslaved people earlier in the 19th century, in the 1850s, that are referred to as the Zélie daguerreotypes. They're called the Zélie daguerreotypes because the photographer was a man named Joseph T. Zélie, and he was commissioned by a Harvard professor named Louis Agassiz, who was a Swiss biologist and sort of an early thinker of racial science. And so he went to South Carolina and visited a plantation, and he wanted to prove that enslaved people, enslaved African Americans, were innately inferior. And so he had these photographs taken of enslaved people. And the photographs were taken, he took them back to Harvard, and they were actually forgotten about until the 1970s. And since the 1970s, there's been a lot of scholarship done on the Zilli daguerreotypes. They've been the focus of a lot of scholarly attention. As well, it's the subject of legislation. One of the descendants of the enslaved people, two of the enslaved people actually, that are in the Zilli daguerreotypes is suing Harvard University over ownership of these photographs. And you might have read about it. There's been a number of articles published about these photographs. So I spend the last third of the chapter talking about sort of these three photographic moments that are related to Harvard University. One is Du Bois being photographed nude when he matriculated at Harvard University. Two is the Zilli daguerreotypes. And the third instance I'm going to talk about later in my talk. But this is an example of one of the Zilli daguerreotypes. This is Renty Taylor, and his daughter was also photographed. Delia Taylor. There's a book about Delia called Delia's Tears. But also, one of the reasons, so the descendant who's suing Harvard University for ownership of these Zilli daguerreotypes, her name is Tamara Lanier. And one of the reasons that Tamara Lanier is suing the university is that, unlike other forms of photographic technology, daguerreotypes were created in the presence of the sitter. Other types of photographic technology, prints are created after the photograph is taken, but a daguerreotype is a glass plate photograph that's created in the moment. So this is an object that was created in the presence of her descendants, which is why it's particularly important that she has ownership of it. One of the arguments that Harvard University has made, and in particular, it's not Harvard University, it's the Peabody Museum at Harvard University. They've sort of said that they're the proper stewards of these photographs. And she's argued that why not one of the descendants be one of the proper stewards of the photographs? And I think her intention is for it to be donated to a Black institution like the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., or the Schomburg in Harlem. One of her critiques is that the photographs have been used by the university for promotional material, for book covers, and scholars have built their careers, and Harvard University has sort of legitimized itself as an institution using these photographs. And so one of her critiques is that these photographs have been digitized, they're made available online. I found this image just by Googling the Zilli daguerreotypes. And it's interesting to contrast how easy it is to find images of the Zilli daguerreotypes online as opposed to these images of Harvard undergrads that are photographed nude. This is my own photograph, but of course you can't find these photographs online. They're very protective of these photographs, of course, but just the sort of distinction that they're making between, Harvard undergrads, the best and brightest, as opposed to these images of enslaved people, which are readily available online and have been digitized. And up until very recently, one could go on the Peabody Museum's website and sort of type in Zilli daguerreotypes, and you'd be able to pull them up. So in a chapter, I look at the Zilli daguerreotypes, but I also look at this moment when Du Bois was photographed nude when he matriculated at Harvard University. But I also make a connection with the 21st century, and I'm interested in particular in Henry Louis Gates and the experience that he had in 2009. So Henry Louis Gates is a very esteemed Harvard professor, literary scholar. You've probably seen him on PBS. He's now sort of transformed himself into a pop genealogist. He has a show called Finding Your Roots, which I happen to love personally. But before he sort of became a public intellectual in that way, in 2009, he was coming home from a business trip in Cambridge University, and he had some trouble opening his door, and his neighbor saw him struggling with the door, not knowing that he lived there. The neighbor assumed that he was breaking into the home and called the police. By the time the police officer arrived, you probably already know the story, but I'm gonna narrate it. By the time the police officer arrived, Gates had already entered his home, and he enters the door, and he's like, "Can I help you?" The police officer is like, "We got a report that your house is being broken into." He's like, "Well, it's not. I live here. Have a nice night." They have a they have a heated exchange. Henry Louis Gates ends up being arrested. The charge is later dropped, not before this mugshot is taken. And so I compare sort of three moments in Harvard University's history, sort of this moment in 2009, the photograph of Du Bois from 1888, but also the photographs of the enslaved people in the Gilded Age. It's sort of three moments related to Harvard in which sort of show instances of discrimination against African Americans. I actually curated an exhibition at Harvard University called Slavery in the Hands of Harvard. And one of the artists created a work that was actually inspired by this moment. This is an installation shot of the exhibition. And this is a close-up of the artwork. The artist is Noel W. Anderson. He's a textile artist. And so, as you can see, he took the mugshot of Henry Louis Gates and juxtaposed it against one of the daguerreotypes in an effort to show continuities in discrimination against African Americans. So those are the three moments that I analyzed in the chapter. Yeah, I'm going to wrap it up there. I would love to get any questions. As Keith Stokes mentioned in the introduction, I'm very active on social media, so feel free to follow me on various platforms. The platform is called Fashioning the Self. And I look forward to getting any questions, critiques, comments, and feedback that you may have. Thank you so much.
Hello, thank you for your talk. You emphasized throughout your presentation how much Du Bois understood and appreciated the power of photography. And I wondered, especially with those images of him as a young child, do you think that that was a belief that was passed down to him from someone in his family, since he was sort of imbuing that at such a young age?
Absolutely, yeah. I think one thing that's really interesting is that not only is there a lot of photographs of Du Bois himself, but there are actually a decent amount of photographs of his parents. So those photographs, he has a photograph of his father, who he wasn't very close with. I think he only met him once in his entire life. And there's also a few photos of his mother as well. So both his parents were photographed. Again, unusual for an African American in the 19th century to have a number of photographs of himself as a child, but also photographs of his parents, and also one photograph of his grandfather. So absolutely, I think his parents and his larger family understood the power of photography and made sure that he was photographed in a very snazzy outfit.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And when you had mentioned the overlap of Newport and your research with Du Bois, I wondered if you also knew about Agassiz and his location here in Newport, too.
Oh, I did not.
So another route for you to take and to hopefully come back again and speak to us. Agassiz created what's called Castle Hill on the island, and it was a marine biology research center built into a natural harbor. So I'm not aware of his entire breadth of study, but I think it's fascinating that that connection comes back here as well. So be happy to help you in any way about supplementing that research and making sure that that record gets documented.
Wow, I wasn't aware of that connection. Thank you so much. Yeah, I know of Louis Agassiz as a Harvard professor, but I didn't know there was a Newport connection as well. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Square. I also have a question about the early photography of W.E.B. Du Bois. Did you mention that he was from circumstances of some poverty?
He grew up impoverished, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering how he has, as a young child, fine clothes, and how the family even could, I don't know if they hired a photographer, but I thought that, at that time, getting your photo taken was kind of more a privilege of people of more, material means. So do you have any thoughts or explanation on that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's something that the family clearly valued. I mean, they understood the power of dressing the part. So even though they were poor, they made an effort to be presentable and to be photographed as such. Over the course of the 19th century, photography became more affordable. So in the early 19th century, like daguerreotypes, for example, were quite expensive. But by the mid to late 19th century, it becomes more and more affordable. So you see more African Americans being photographed. So they were poor, but they weren't living in dire poverty. They had some means. One thing that they were rich in was community, because several generations of his family had lived in Great Barrington, and so he was never hungry. So they were poor, but he had some access to means.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, thank you for your talk.
Oh, thank you.
So, with Du Bois's consciousness of dress, as you've shown, and dressing well, I was wondering, with all these photographs of him and his, the record of what he wore, have you been able to track his fashion preferences, if he had certain tastes that he preferred to wear over others?
Yeah, he was a bit conservative in his personal style. He preferred suiting. Over the course of his life, that does start to loosen up more. You see him wearing tan suits later in life, but earlier in his life, it tend to be dark suiting, navy, black, or at most a plaid suit. Towards the end of his life, in the middle of his life, he sort of experimented with, as a lot of scholars, with Trotskyism and communism, and towards the end of his life, he ended up getting blacklisted by the U.S. government and was forced to leave. He actually chose to leave the United States because of certain actions by the American government. And towards the end of his life, you start seeing him experimenting with African textiles. So he'd wear sort of traditional Western suiting, but he'd throw on a kente cloth wrapper over the suit. And so he started adopting the sort of local dress practices of Ghana, the Akan people, in his dress practice. But he was always a dandy, always very smart, always very dapper, but still, like, he focused on suiting in his personal style.
Hi, Professor. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. I was wondering if you had some photos or information on the time where he became more of an activist, and what style of clothes he was wearing and how it contrasted with Marcus Garvey. I know they weren't necessarily friends, but I don't know if their attire reflected that as well.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about like protest dress, particularly African American protest dress in the mid 20th century, I'm thinking about like SNCC and how they wore denim overalls in solidarity with sharecroppers, or thinking about like the Black Power movement and how they wore leather jackets and berets, sort of like signaling sort of solidarity with like revolutionaries. Du Bois wasn't quite doing that. He was rather conservative in his, like, he was born in the late 19th century. I spoke with, Du Bois's biographer, David Levering Lewis, who wrote this sort of authoritative text on Du Bois, like a tome, like it's this big, literally. Just to see if I had like missed any like important fashion reference from his life. He wore suiting pretty much his entire life, like, suit jackets, trousers, button-up shirts, and the most he ever sort of experimented with his fashion was towards the end of his life when he was in Ghana, when he started wearing bits and pieces of African textiles. So like the protest dress that we think of like in the mid 20th century, like Black Power or SNCC, Du Bois wasn't really sort of expressing himself in that way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for, this was so informative. I just was really curious around the idea of imagery and how important, it's everywhere. And I know like in the sports world, the whole NIL piece is very big now and giving credit where credit is due. And I wonder how that would fit into this narrative of fashioning the self and giving, like you said, the ancestors really the credit for those images that are being used in universities and such.
Totally. I mean, one thing, just in response to your question, it makes me think that, in many ways, Du Bois is unusual in that he was able to be credentialed and published several books and made a name for himself, but many African Americans weren't afforded those kind of privileges. And, one way of expressing yourself, one power that you have is the power over your own body. And Du Bois used that power, and many black folks in the 19th and up into the present day use their bodies as a form of politics. And so, enslaved people or free people of color may not have had access to the press or may not have had direct access to governmental bodies, but they had access how they were able to dress and how they were able to express themselves to the world. So I'd say that self-fashioning is an important political tool. And it's also a tool that's immediately recognizable and readable. There's no nuance in how you're dressed. So you sort of see someone and you immediately can make a judgment about them. And so I think black folks in the 19th century used that to their advantage.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I have a question inspired by your Instagram handle up there and all the places we can follow you at Fashioning the Self. What do you think Du Bois would have made of social media, and how do you think he would have expressed himself?
Ooh, I love that question. Especially as someone who is a big fan of social media. Good question. I mean, I think he would have been very active on social media. I think he would have had, before Elon Musk took over Twitter, I think he would have I think he would have been very active on Twitter. It's something I think a lot about, actually. Thinking about someone like Frederick Douglass, who also was very much engaged with photography and wrote significantly about the power of photography for African Americans. I think he would have been very active on social media. And I think someone like Sojourner Truth, who actually sold images of herself at events. She sold carte de visite of herself. And the carte de visite said, I sell the shadow to support the substance. And so she understood the power of photography as well. I recently wrote an article for Miss Magazine about Harriet Tubman, about her self-fashioning, because there's been a number of new photographs of Harriet Tubman that have been found. And we tend to think of Harriet Tubman as being very camera shy or even stoic, but these early photographs you see her, like, she understood the power of photography as well and also was very fashionable. So these early African-American civil rights leaders and abolitionists understood the power of photography, and I think they would have been active on social media. I even think someone like, thinking about Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, they also were very concerned about their self-presentation. So yeah, it's a tool. Just like fashion is a tool, social media is a tool too.
Final call for questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Square, for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
I would like to remind everyone that our next upcoming lecture is on May 16th, Am I Not a Man and a Woman? The Rise of African Heritage Political Identity in Gilded Age, Rhode Island. We hope to see you then. Thank you for everyone on Zoom and in person. If you're in person, please join us in the reception out on the loggia. We also have the exhibit open on the second floor. Thank you.